Thank you for listening to the program. If you'd like to offer feedback on any of our programming, please email us at info@wpfw.org.
The talk show Africa Now airs Wednesdays at 1 p.m. It's a modern view on historical issues concerning the entire African world, addressing how African people are participating in globalization, ways in which the rest of the world continues to exploit African resources, uncovering labor violations by corrupt politicians and Western government powers. Learn what's happening now in interviews with artists, activists, scholars, and a host of other experts each episode. Wednesdays at 1 p.m. Africa Now is also available from iTunes Podcasts, Google Play Music, as well as SoundCloud on your station for Jazz and Justice, WPFW, Washington.
Good morning. Welcome to What's at Stake, a conversation on current events, sometimes controversial issues, and the topics that are at the core of justice, doing right, and being right in the community and the world. I'm Reverend Graylan Scott Hagler, your co-host every second Wednesday of the month, and our executive producer is Verna Avery Brown. Today we have joining with us DC Councilmember Brianne Nadeau, who represents the District of Columbia's Ward 1 and has occupied that seat since 2015. Last week, Mayor Bowser put out in her newsletter that she was going to aggressively embark on dismantling of the tent cities that have grown across the city in recent months. In that newsletter, she outlined her rationale, citing humanitarian concerns. Many homeless advocates have been up in arms concerning her initiative to remove these encampments. And she cites that the people in the encampment will be housed in permanent and temporary housing. There are questions about how true those claims are. Yesterday, the DC Council held its legislative session. On the agenda was emergency legislation that Councilmember Nadeau sponsored. The council voted to postpone action on this bill. And I'm gonna turn to Councilmember Nadeau right now, and I'm gonna just ask her to explain to us what was in that bill and why it was necessary to try to bring that bill and get it passed before the council. Good morning, Councilmember Nadeau, and welcome.
Good morning. Thanks so much for having me. It's nice to be here. Here we are. I introduced legislation to pause the encampment clearings, not because I think that people should be living in encampments, exactly the opposite. As council member, as chair of the Committee on Human Services, I've actually put millions and millions of dollars in the budget to house people experiencing homelessness. And as a housing first jurisdiction, that should always be our goal. So there's parts of this pilot that are great, right? Focusing on housing people who are living in tents is a really good thing. The challenge is the how. This has been going on for several months now. On October 4th, there was an incident in an encampment clearing where heavy machinery was clearing a tent while someone was still in it. And there's just no reason that there should be so much callousness when we're talking about any of our residents, but especially folks who are so vulnerable. There's no reason we should set an arbitrary deadline. You got to be housed by this date, or we're going to take away your tent and your, shelter and all the things that you have. You got to move on. When people are experiencing homelessness, they're going through a lot of trauma. And we're also talking about having to take a leap of faith and trusting the government that what they're offering you is real, that the promise they're making is going to be fulfilled. So, if I walk down to an encampment and I say to someone, all right, we got housing for you, they might look at me and be like, okay, lady, right? I've heard that one before. So this takes real work. So the legislation would pause the clearings. We'd still be working to house folks. We'd be requiring the mayor to do more cleaning, provide sanitary measures like porta potties and hand washing stations, regular cleanings and supplies, and safety measures, fire safety trainings, things like that. Because, if the tents are going to be there while we're housing people, then we need to provide more sanitation measures.
Yeah, it seems like the mayor is saying though that she has the solution, and therefore, the postponement would mean that she could not implement the solution. Does she have the solutions?
Well, here's what I can say. I've been doing this a little while and overseeing homelessness in particular. We really in the past have not made moves like this during hypothermia season. It's not a best practice to clear an encampment in the cold, because a tent is often the thing that makes the difference between life and death when you're sleeping outside. When I was on my way Thursday morning to the encampment clearing at New Jersey, I actually passed somebody who had died on the street overnight in Ward 1 when we were passing by the scene. And those tents provide the shelter, the warmth that can help you make it through the night. Do I want people sleeping in tents? No. I want them inside. But there are legitimate reasons that people make the choice to sleep outside. And you can imagine how difficult that decision must be, right? There must be a very serious reason that you've made the choice you're going to sleep in a tent rather than coming into shelter, right? So it's a challenge all around. The idea that it's so black and white, that we're going to set a date, everyone's going to move by that date. If it was that black and white, we would have done it before. And what's interesting is this legislation was supported by such a huge coalition of local and national organizations that do this work. Pathways to Housing, who is the partner on the ground that does the engagement, the street outreach for our homeless residents, who was one of the first leaders in this city on the Housing First model. They have condemned it. They've condemned the pilot. More than 80 advisory neighborhood commissioners support the bill. That's unheard of. When have we ever had 80 ANC commissioners agree on one thing?
But let me ask this question, because what would the postponement have done?
It would have said, sorry, did I interrupt you?
No, fine. Go ahead.
So the postponement would have said you can't force people to leave public space during hypothermia, period. Keep doing the rest. Keep housing them. Keep offering them hotels and permanent housing. Keep cleaning. Keep providing sanitation services. Keep those spaces safe, but don't make them move during hypothermia season.
My question is, how effective, though, is the mayor in terms of finding permanent and temporary housing? And what is there? I mean, what is there to sort of catch people that are being displaced now, being displaced from tents, et cetera? I know that they're making the statement that there's housing, temporary and permanent housing, but I'm not sure if that's the case. Has anybody been able to document whether that's the case or not?
Yes. Okay. And this is not a straightforward answer either, but if you stick with me, I'll walk you through it. So, the first encampment clearings under this program were in Noma. And we know that essentially what happens is the teams go out, they create what's called a by name list of all the people that are there the day they take the census. Okay. And then they figure out who's eligible for what. There's a lot of people who will be eligible for the housing that council funded. Permanent supportive housing is the gold standard. That's for someone who's probably been going through a lot and needs extra supports with their housing, wraparound services. And that is the thing that I've funded every year. But with the Hearts and Homes and Hearts Amendment that we passed in this budget, we've got $65 million a year going into these programs. And that's right now. So the housing exists, but not everybody's eligible for it. So there's two things. One, some people are going to be eligible for that. Some people are going to be eligible for rapid rehousing, which is a shorter term housing subsidy. And what they're doing through this pilot, which I think is good, is if they determine you're eligible, they'll let you stay in a hotel until all your paperwork goes through. Or in some cases, they'll house you before your paperwork goes through. Those are good things. Those are innovations. Now, the challenge is when people hear you're going to get housed if you're in an encampment, what happens is more people come. So after the by name list is created, there may be more people coming. By the time they do the clearing, there's a lot of people who just have to move on again because they're not being offered anything. We know people from Noma moved to New Jersey and O. By the time we did the clearing Thursday at New Jersey and O, some of the people who weren't on the by name list had already moved on to another site. And that's what happens when you do these clearings and shut down the site. People go other places. And the challenge is we work really hard. I created a street outreach team to work with people outside experiencing homelessness And those folks know everybody's sleeping outside. But once they start moving around the city, it's harder to keep them connected to services. You know, different organizations are working in different areas. A person moving from one encampment to another may lose a connection to the organization they were working with before. And then the other thing is that just not everybody's eligible for it.
Right. What are the root causes? Because that's the issue that we should be, I think, talking about. What's the root causes of this? Because one of the things that anybody who's lived in the district for some time, you've seen a proliferation of encampments all across the city, in parks, over overpasses, under bridges. So there's something that's going on that has put people in that very vulnerable position of basically having to pitch a tent in order to survive. What's going on?
Well, I mean, housing instability is a very real thing. The affordable housing crisis, we've talked about that before. You know, housing is expensive in the city. And during the pandemic, a lot of people lost their jobs. You know, there's a lot of reasons that you become homeless. You know, sure, a lot of times when you think of homeless people, you think of folks who are chronically homeless who might have a mental illness or some other issue, but it's not everyone. You know, on New Jersey, you know, there was a couple there who moved here to be closer to a young child, and they couldn't afford housing, so they ended up sleeping in a tent. You have people who've lost work and can't pay rent, they end up in a tent, or people who are working. I mean, you have working people who get up every morning after sleeping out in a park and go to their job because rent is really expensive in the city. So, you know, it's about increasing work opportunities, and it's about building more housing so that we can make it more affordable, and subsidizing as needed, which, you know, we do a lot of in Ward 1, but it's all those things, right? The issues we have with families and individuals experiencing homelessness, you know, are a result of larger economic issues in the city.
If you're just joining us, you're listening to What's at Stake on WPFW FM 89.3. And we're speaking with Council Member Brianne Nadeau, who is the council member from Ward 1. And we've been talking about sort of legislative action yesterday, particularly in terms of a emergency bill that she put forth to try to postpone the dismantling of these encampments across the city, citing that there needed to be more wraparound services, et cetera, that take place in order to really preserve the safety and the dignity of people on the streets. And so I wanted to lift that up to hear so that you can hear what was in that bill. Now, with the council kicking this down the field, does that mean that the mayor can just move ahead while it's been postponed?
Yeah, I mean, that's the challenge, right? We're halfway through hypothermia season at this point. It's supposed to snow today. It was 32 degrees last night. And by waiting, we, you know, allow this to continue. And that's the challenge. You know, I think, yeah.
So by editorializing would say that this can was kicked down the field so that the council, when they come back to debate it, they're going to say it's a moot issue because the mayor has already dismantled the encampments. Is that correct?
I don't know. I mean, here's what I've seen. I feel like when you have so much momentum around a bill like this, and then you postpone it, you really end up losing a lot of momentum. And sometimes, you know, I intend to bring it back, but a lot of times it's like, it's lost so much momentum, there's almost no point in voting for it. And the idea behind the postponement, you know, the mover of the motion was, it was more time to build consensus. I mean, we didn't have 9 votes yesterday.
That was Alyssa Silverman. That was Alyssa Silverman who put the bill, who put the amendment forward to postpone it.
Yeah, and she wants to work with some other members who want to make some tweaks to the bill. You know, I said, I'm happy to make tweaks to the bill. You know, we had circulated it Thursday, so I was happy to make tweaks all those days before. And I'm concerned. I didn't want to lose yesterday, but I also am not sure the people that were going to vote against it yesterday are going to change their minds in 2 weeks. And so it would have been nice to just sort of have on the record where everybody was on this so we could think about what the next steps are. So the whole problem with this postponement is to basically, I'm gonna put it my way.
to grandstand and say nice things about your concern for those who are without homes while at the same time doing nothing.
I don't know that that was the intent of Councilmember Silverman, because I do think she genuinely wants this bill to pass. But I think the challenge is getting to 9.
Well, I think the issue is not just Silverman, but it's all the others that felt that we should postpone it, right?
Yeah.
It's Silverman and everybody else, right? So it's the idea that we can talk about our concern for, and I heard the language being used yesterday, concern for our homeless neighbors. Well, they're neighbors as long as they're not in your neighborhood. That's what it boils down to. And so again, we sort of deal with this issue over and over again, particularly in a city where the wealth gap, the income gap has gotten wider and wider and wider. And the ability and the issue around housing affordability has become almost nil in terms of being able to afford housing.
What's really interesting to me is the narrative that we get sometimes around encampments from residents that just makes me kind of sick to my stomach, where, you know, the encampments are depicted as unsafe because people living there must be criminals, right? I mean, we have to have more compassion around this issue, right? I don't want people sleeping in tents, but I also acknowledge that people sleeping in tents are there for so many different reasons, right? And that they're having a very difficult time and they've been through a lot. You know, it could be somebody who's left an abusive partner, you know, it could be, there's so many reasons that you could be sleeping in a tent. And I really get frustrated and angry, and maybe disgusted is a good word, when people say to me, well, how would you like it if those tents were across the street from your house? Like, we don't have any folks who are homeless in Ward 1. We do. I mean, actually, Reverend, there is a homeless man who sleeps on my front porch sometimes, and I'm not afraid of him. You know, I'm worried about him, but we have to have compassion.
There you go. There's the word, compassion. Compassion. It's not just based on dollars and cents. It's got to be based on a deeper moral value, that we place some value on human life, no matter what predicament somebody may be in. And so that's really what's at stake, because it's the soul of the city. And I think that we got to sort of begin to talk about it as the soul of the city. You know, do we have a soul of compassion? I'm not talking about religion here. I'm talking about the deep spiritual values that link us together as human beings. Do we have a soul?
And how do we treat the most vulnerable people, right? In my faith, the commandments go that the thing that you're supposed to do, the highest good, are the things you're never going to get anything in return for, right? The holiest thing you can do is help someone who's died, right? Like caring for them, because they're never going to help you, right? Yeah. But you go back from there, like helping somebody who's really vulnerable. That's why I got into office, right? I didn't get in here to make people richer. I got in here to make government work for people who need it.
Yes. I'm gonna jump on to another subject, and that subject is the council voted to change the name of Woodrow Wilson High School. And tell us some of the rationale behind changing the name and what the name has been changed to.
Okay, so as we know, Woodrow Wilson was racist, so we don't like things named after him here in the District of Columbia. So we've named that school after the first Black female teacher and the first Black superintendent. So it's got a hyphenate, and you can put me on the spot before my coffee this morning about how it all turned out, but I think it's a nice choice. There was a lot of discussion about whether we should put both names on the school.
It's Reed Jackson, right?
Reed Jackson, thank you.
Yes.
Thank you, Edna Jackson. You know, I didn't have a dog in this fight in terms of what the name ultimately was, other than let's make sure it's not Woodrow Wilson. I think it's really nice that we chose to honor two Black leaders who really had a deep connection to the city and to that school in particular. I mean, in Ward 1, I always try when we're naming something like an alley or a street, always prefer to name after a person of color or a woman, because so much is changing in our community that naming things after pieces of our history and people who were important is really critical to making sure that folks who come after us, folks who are new, know where they are, and who came before them. So I think that it really matters. I'm excited about it. So there were some folks who wanted to split it or to make it named after one person, which I get too. But I think this was a rational compromise, and it gets to honor two people instead of one.
Good. So the new name honors Vincent Reed, the first Black principal of the high school, and Edna Jackson, the school's first Black teacher that faced a lot of opposition upon coming into that school.
And Vincent Reed became superintendent, I believe, eventually. So
yes.
Worked with the union leaders in a really difficult time, and it's very special. And I think it's incumbent on all of us to teach the children who go to the new school who it's named after, right? A lot of times, time marches on, people don't even think about why the school is named what it is. So you've got to continually educate people about the names too.
Let me ask you about Calvin Coolidge High School.
Mm-hmm.
Is there any momentum to change that name?
I don't know. I mean, there's a whole renaming commission. So I think we're working our way through.
Well, let me share some history with you.
Please.
Coolidge's handling of the Great Mississippi River flood in 1927 creates really some questions about whether that school should continue to bear his name. In that incident, most white communities were saved, but Riverside Black communities were deliberately flooded to reduce the pressure on the levees. And then these thousands of displaced Blacks were forced to work for rations under the gun of the National Guard and area planters, leading to an epidemic of mass beatings, lynchings, and rapes. And Coolidge also signed one of the most racist and ethnocentric immigration acts in history, the Immigration Act of 1924, which was a bipartisan measure that restricted immigration from Southern and Eastern European countries, severely restricted African immigrants, and banned the immigrations of Arabs and Asians. And he also said at his first annual message to Congress in 1923 that America must be kept American.
Wow, that sounds familiar, doesn't it?
Yes. It's interesting because what we do, we dress up the history of a lot of these folks later on, leave out the blemishes, and sort of just focus on the things that sort of fits into the narrative that we're trying to construct. And, and I personally feel that we got enough in DC to honor. We got enough history in DC to honor our own, rather than honoring folks who, one, didn't care anything about voting rights, didn't care anything about Black folks, didn't care anything about Latino folks, didn't care anything about Arabs or Asians, right? That type of stuff. We need to, in a sense, begin to distance ourselves from those names and say, no, we aim to be a beacon of inclusion and what inclusion looks like and feels like. You want to comment on that?
I agree 100%. I mean, it's kind of what I was getting at with naming streets, right? It's an opportunity with the street that isn't named already. It's an opportunity to actually honor that history and honor local leaders. I mean, because of the history of the District of Columbia, a lot of things here are named after national leaders, right? We didn't have home rule. We didn't get to decide what to name our buildings and streets. So, I'm excited about shedding some of these names because I don't want our city, I don't want our students to be associated with people who've frankly, I mean, what you've described, those are atrocities, right? That's not who we are as a district.
Right. I want one more subject before we take a little break and hear a PSA. Is that also there was a vote yesterday on a vaccine mandate. Can you clarify for us what that vote meant and what are its implications?
Yeah. So we were doing a couple of things. There was one that was clarifying the caregivers and teachers. And then we've also worked through a vaccine mandate for students. So by the beginning of the next school year, so fall of 2022, the coronavirus vaccine will be mandated in all the populations for which there is the final approval of the vaccine. So not the temporary authorization, but the final authorization. That gives people a lot of time. And it gives us time to do a lot of work in building trust in the vaccine and in communities where there hasn't been that trust. But it's an effort to keep kids safe and keep schools safe. We require other vaccines. One of the things that I contributed to that bill with the help of Councilmember Henderson was to require the vaccine records to be transmitted to schools electronically. I'm a parent of 2 small kids. Can I just tell you that checkup every year where we have to get all the papers signed is such a pain in the butt. I mean, do your checkups, of course, but the documentation and having to get it and having to bring it and having to get it to the right place in the school office and make sure it gets on file, it's a lot. And I only have 2 kids. There's people who are doing this for many more. Some doctor's offices actually charge for the paperwork. You know, let's say you're getting charged $25 a pop and you got 3 kids. Not everybody can afford that. So we know that we have lower compliance rates with the already mandated vaccines than we should. And so by making that electronic, parents don't have to worry about that. It just gets sent to the schools. And that'll help us, I think, because I think part of it's a paperwork issue. I don't think we have a lot of kids running around that aren't vaccinated for measles, mumps, and rubella, you know, but I do think that administrative hurdles are a real thing, especially for parents.
Right. Thank you for that. Thank you for that. We're going to take a break for our PSA. You've been listening to What's at Stake, WPFW FM 89.3. I am Reverend Graylan Hagler, your host every second Wednesday of the month. And we are talking with DC Council member Brianne Nadeau concerning a host of issues that affects us, the people of DC and in the region. And so after our break, we will come back to you.
The best in live music is coming to Bethesda Blues and Jazz Supper Club, a special holiday concert featuring Grammy Award-winning saxophonist Kirk Whalen, Saturday, December 18th. Kirk Whalen is well known for his collaborations with music legends Whitney Houston, Luther Vandross, Al Jarreau, Quincy Jones, and Barbra Streisand, among others. Once again, he brings his annual holiday concert featuring special guest singers and musicians to Bethesda Blues and Jazz for an inspiring evening of soulful jazz, gospel, and Christmas songs. Don't miss Kirk Whalen at Bethesda Blues and Jazz on Saturday, December 18th. The doors will open at 6 p.m. and the showtime is 8 p.m. For tickets and information, go to bbjlive.com or call the box office at 240-330-4500. WPFW is proud to be a media partner with Bethesda Blues and Jazz Supper Club.
Again, if you're joining with us, you are listening to What's at Stake, WPFW FM 89.3. I am Reverend Graylan Scott Hagler, your host every second Wednesday of the month. And we are speaking with DC Council Member Brianne Nadeau from Ward 1 concerning a host of issues. And I want to invite you, if you're interested in getting in on the discussion, you can call us at 202-588-0893. Let me repeat that, 202-588-0893, and we will be happy to receive your calls. Now, council member, I want to just open up a big topic, and that topic has been and is redistricting in the District of Columbia. Mm-hmm. Tell us where we are on that. Are things settled? Are things still in negotiations? Things still in flux? You're going to have a vote on that soon, right? And what does it look like?
Yeah, we did. We had our first full council vote yesterday. Right. You know what? Redistricting is really tough. And I'm going to tell you something that will contribute to my reputation of being a nerd, which is that I have been obsessed with the census and redistricting since I was in high school when I did my Girl Scout Gold project on the census there and getting people counted. I participated 10 years ago after my time on the ANC in the discussion, trying to reunite U Street into Ward 1. Still haven't gotten that done. It's a long story. We don't have to get into it today, but we saw major growth in Ward 6 and we had to adjust. We had to adjust the map. This was probably the most transparent process there's ever been. The subcommittee chaired by Councilmember Silverman and joined by Council members Henderson and Bonds had hearings on each ward. There was a kickoff hearing citywide and then one for each ward and then a capstone hearing. There were draft maps circulated for comment based on what was heard at the public hearings. And then ultimately, the final maps were issued and sent to the committee of the whole. So we voted on that yesterday. It was a really good discussion. I mean, I think that there's been a lot of good collaboration between council members. These are never easy decisions, right? I mean, on its face, redistricting is about fairness, adjusting boundaries to ensure that people have equal representation in each ward, looking at different populations and making sure that they have equal and advantageous representation. And so, people feel, it's nice that people feel really strong affiliations with the wards they live in, but we have to remember that lines on a map don't create community, right? The stuff that we do on the ground is what creates community. So I think we're going to be in a good place. The next part is that the wards each get to have their committees to redraw the A and C lines.
All right. Somebody is texting me and saying that I'm gonna read it just as I got the text.
Oh, great.
It says she is stealing the Armed Forces retirement home, referring to you, from Black residents in Ward 5 and 1. What's your response to that?
Well, there's no stealing, right? Everything in the District of Columbia belongs to all of us. So the Armed Forces retirement home is right there on the borders of wards 1, 4, and 5. Used to be in Ward 4, has been in Ward 5 for about 20 years. So 2 cycles. And it borders Parkview in Ward 1, which is it's a African-American neighborhood in Ward 1 largely, right? So when those gates come down, which they will, because there's housing and parks being built there, the neighborhood most impacted is Parkview. The other side in Ward 5, the boundary is North Capitol, which is a highway. So when you think about neighborhood continuity, it really makes sense that you would bring this into Ward 1 because we are the ones who are most deeply impacted by what happens there. The headquarters of the Friends of the Old Soldiers Home is actually in Ward 1. ANC 1A has done a lot of work and provided grants for special events there so the community can come in and volunteer and participate. It's a really beautiful partnership. So, I think it's a good thing that it's been drawn into Ward 1. Yeah, my husband's a veteran, and I really take incredibly seriously the care of our veterans and the hundreds of veterans that are retired there. I would be proud to have them be my constituents. And I'm really happy with the relationship I have with the commandant there, who, is not a political person, so hasn't weighed in on which side this should be. But I think it doesn't need to be about politics, and it's just a boundary. But the reality is that the things that have been drawn into Ward 1 geographically are more closely linked to us, and we've really taken on a lot of leadership and responsibility in caring for them.
Thank you very much. And there is some heat behind it. I think we have a caller on the line. Caller, are you there? Good morning.
Yes, good morning.
Welcome to the discussion.
Yes. So I was a former resident of Ward 1, and I went to what initially was built as Lincoln Junior High School, and then turned into Bell Lincoln Educational Campus, and now it's the Columbia Heights Educational Campus. And I'm concerned about some lost history there. I went to Gordon Junior High when we had busing, and then I went to Lincoln, and in 9th grade, I won the citywide science fair in physics, beat out a kid from Alice Deal. And I eventually did go to the former Woodrow Wilson High School, and it was still predominantly white at the time. Next year, looking forward to celebrating, however, my 50th class reunion. I don't know how we'll do that. Well, I guess as former Wilson students, but I appreciate the renaming of the school. I'm all for that. But my concern is that when I tried to look up some history about Lincoln Junior High, I couldn't find any. And I think the issue there is because, unfortunately, Lincoln had some serious asbestos issues, and they tried to do some abatement, and eventually they tore down the whole school. It was built in, well, the school year opened up in '67, so it was a new facility. And so my concern is, because I've had a good friend of mine who died a couple of years ago, and I'm just wondering if it might have been related to some issues with asbestos. And with that said, let me bring up another issue, which
be very brief, because we have some other callers calling and we want to get them on.
I'm just talking about McMillan Park, with some concerns about the development that's due to take place there without any impact studies, as there's some possibility of asbestos in the soil that will be stirred up by the development process going there. So you know.
Good question. Good question. Thank you for that question. Thank you so much, Council Member.
It's a lot to unpack.
Yes.
Thank you so much for all of this. I mean, I think, wow, you raise a lot of good issues. And I'm very sorry about the loss of your friend. I mean, I think capturing this history is really important. You know, one of the things that we've been working on in the council is actually beefing up the archives, getting them new space, and making sure that we can keep track of this stuff. I know there have been times when I've looked for, you know, a photo, say, of a building that doesn't exist anymore, and it's really hard to find. And we have to do a better job of that, because that history is meaningful to people and it matters. So, yeah.
Good. And if you're just tuning in, you're listening to What's at Stake on WPFW FM 89.3. I'm Reverend Graylan Scott Hagler, your host every second Wednesday of the month, and we're speaking with Council Member Brianne Nadeau, Council Member Ward 1. We have another caller on the line. Good morning, caller. Welcome to What's at Stake. Go ahead, you're on.
Hello?
Yes, go ahead.
All right, thank you. I just wanted to call about the issue of redistricting in the Armed Forces Retirement Home development. A couple of things for the record. The Washington Business Journal said that this is the largest real estate development ever in the district. So it's about redistricting, but it's about development and the curious decision to move this development and the implications for impact and who shapes the development. Specifically, these issues of racial equity, anti-Black family displacement, and affordability. And you can draw a straight through line between the first topic of homelessness and affordability and the reasons for why people are unhoused with these types of developments not conducted in a way that gets input from the community and is actually affordable for working class, for Black families. And this, so that's point one. And the rationale given for the move on meetings that I've been in are sort of gifting developments to certain wards and certain communities, which is it's a question of whether that's legal and appropriate, and it's certainly not the stated goals of the redistricting process. And the last point I want to make is that the development team, Madison Marquette and Urban Atlantic, and the Federal General Services Administration presented to ANCs in Ward 4 in Petworth, of which I'm a member, and ANCs in 1A, and I believe in Ward 5 as well. The entrance gate of Armed Forces Retirement Home is in Petworth. It's tied to 3,000 residents that are there. There's grants that are given from ANC 4C. There's a charter school there.
Yes, yes.
You know,
Mhm.
it's just absolutely absurd to suggest that Parkview is the only or even the deepest impacted community. And the point is that the demographics are different, and it has a material effect on who gets to influence the project, which is what this is about. And we need to look at the records of how developments are conducted if we really want to back up to talk about racial equity, deep affordability, and community benefits that really benefit Black and Brown residents, and back up the talk.
All right. Thank you. Thank you, caller. Want to get some other callers on the line. Will you respond to that, council member?
I thought I
Allowed to respond
recognized
to.
that voice. I thought I recognized that voice. Okay, so you know what? I love this discussion. I think this is exactly the right. These are a lot of the right things we should be talking about. This is a major development in the center of the city. It's going to impact all 3 wards that touch it and beyond. It's also a federal project, which is an extra challenge. And I've been really proud of the work that I've done tackling some of the projects in our ward that deal with the federal government. It's no easy task. So I'm looking forward to working on this wherever it ends up. You know, the Ward 4 council member does support it being in Ward 1. And if you look at the map, the neighborhoods that are most impacted by this are not in Ward 5 because you have that hard boundary of North Capitol Street. And that's one of the reasons that we really think this creates an area of interest, which is part of the charge of the redistricting code.
It's important to have these discussions and to get these issues out there, because I think
Absolutely.
that we really hear that there's some real burning concern around what's going to happen, what things are going to look like, who's going to be where, in what ward and what district, et cetera. And it's something that's important to take a look at in these. I think we do have another caller on the line. I'm gonna go to that caller because it's good to interact with our public.
Yeah.
Good morning. It's good to have you here. Welcome, caller.
Yes, my name's Cliff. I lived in Ward 1 for 50 years, and I'm the guy who 6 years ago appeared before the city council and suggested that the new state be named for Frederick Douglass rather than Christopher Columbus. But I have a question about renaming. Is there any discussion between the city council or the city government with the Washington football team about a name tying it to DC? I mean, Baltimore has the Ravens, named after a poem by Poe, who lived in Baltimore. I'm thinking maybe we should be called the Washington Emancipators for Emancipation Day, or the Washington North Stars, named after the newspaper, abolitionist newspaper of Frederick Douglass. I was just wondering whether there'd been any discussion between the city government and the Washington football team.
Ooh, it only took us 40 minutes to get to the football team.
Go ahead, council member.
Thank you, Cliff.
And I would add this. One thing that needs to happen if you're going to have a Washington football team is for the football team to be in Washington. But let me leave that alone.
You know, listen, it's a trade-off, right? I mean, if you leave the team in Maryland, they get to keep the traffic. They get to, and we could maybe use that land for something that people need, like housing. I'm putting it out there. All right. So I have not had any conversations with them. I know that they have been engaging the council a lot, really, because they've been going through this transformation. They've been trying very hard to restore their reputation through action, not just words, which I appreciate very much. And although the name of the football team isn't my number one focus, because obviously we got a lot of other stuff going on, I do care about it. I'm glad it's not what it was. I don't have a strong opinion on what it is, but I agree. I mean, we're having a conversation about naming things. It is better in my mind if it's tied to our community. And I know when it was originally, when the name was rescinded, let's say, there were a lot of conversations online in particular about what the name should be. And I can tell you, when I was watching that happen, you know, when people were using sort of generic names or sort of national type of names, the community did not like that very much. So I'm hopeful that they come up with something that's tied to our history and our communities, rather than just sort of something flashy or something that, like, people who don't understand the difference between the capital and the people living in the district think of, right? Like, let's not make it something national. Let's make it something local.
Let me ask another question, because we've had some controversy around the DC jail. and particularly the inequity. And when I say the inequity, it's people should be up in arms. I'm up in arms over the fact that January 6 rioters would get special treatment and be heard over the advocates in DC who have been complaining about the conditions in the DC jails and central cell holding. Where are you in terms of that? I know that's not necessarily under your committee, but you should have a concern about it. What's your concern about it?
Oh, yeah. I mean, look, we've talked already today about how we have to care for our most vulnerable people. I mean, someone who is locked up without the ability to care for themselves is right up there in terms of our most vulnerable people, right? And when you have guards who have this abuse of power of mistreating residents of the jail, that's completely unacceptable. You know, I think this report, it didn't tell us stuff we didn't know. I mean, it showed us that things had gotten worse, but there's just, it's really not okay. I mean, and there's some challenges with that workforce that we've known about that have been really hard to overcome. The conditions themselves of the facility are not good, right? We've been trying to build a new one.
But it's also clear that that has not been a priority with elected officials because we've been complaining about this for years. And when I went into Central Cell Block, when I was arrested for praying in front of the Supreme Court, it was filthy, roaches, all types of filth down in that hole. And that's your entrance into the system. And so if you could imagine, it gets worse from there. And the last time we had a conversation, the pastor from Metropolitan, the head of the social justice for the Presbyterian Church, met with the director of corrections. Basically, the argument was, well, we're waiting for private, public investment to build a new facility, which is ridiculous. It's a con. And so, you know, there needs to be some focus on this with some urgency right now, because it should be, people also should be just ticked off that it takes white rioters, let me put it this way, white insurrectionists to come into the system, and all of a sudden there's a spotlight on the system, even though we have been advocating that for 20, 30, 40 years around what's going on in the system, and it seems to fall on deaf ears.
I agree with you. I think it's a bunch of bull. And
Right.
and you know, and I'm committed to it. You know, you're right. It hasn't been under my purview. That doesn't mean I don't care about it. But I think, you know, we got to resolve it, not because there's, you know, look, I think those insurrectionists can rot. But I don't want them to be able to say they rotted because they were in a bad facility in the District of Columbia. So,
well, they went out and got somebody food because they said they needed organic food.
Yeah, I mean,
come on.
It's ridiculous.
Right.
I agree with you. It's ridiculous.
We have a couple more callers on the line. Come on. Good morning, callers. Welcome. It's good to have you here on WPFW. What's at stake? Go ahead. Good morning. You're on the air.
Yes. First of all, thank you so much, Reverend Hagler, for this discussion. I'm in Ward 5, Mary Nesnick, and I am very happy you're talking about the lack of resources and investment in home unhoused people. But I'm concerned about Council Member Brianne Nadeau's affiliation with Israeli Advocacy, which has created one of the most egregious areas of international homelessness and people forced out. And so the parallels between the Palestinian refugees and the homeless all over the United States, I think, have some merit. And I wondered if she could talk about her advocacy for Israel in former employment and whether or not she has changed her views on the rights of Palestinians to return to their homes.
Thank you, Carla, for that comment. Council member.
Interesting. So Reverend Hagler, you know that I'm Jewish, right?
Yes.
Okay.
You know that I'm Christian, right?
I heard that about you.
Go ahead.
So I don't really do advocacy in that way anymore. But I support the right of the state of Israel to exist, you know, and, I always have. I also support the right of the Palestinians to have a state and to live free of tyranny. And I support relief efforts and I support their self-determination. And I think, it's complicated for American political leaders to get further into the details than that, because that is something that has to be worked out by those governments, right? But I have found it difficult sometimes here, where an organization or a person will say, because I'm Jewish or because someone else is Jewish, it becomes, we're really walking a line, and not this caller, but we're really walking a line in the city of anti-Semitism and tying every Jewish person to the actions of what's going on in the Middle East. And that is not what our community is about. And so I think it's really important to name that and know that, yeah.
One of the things that's important, council member, in this issue, because I led a group of preachers to Palestine in 2016.
Yeah.
And I was there with cultural artists in 2014. And it's clearly an apartheid state. It was like, and is worse than, the segregation that I grew up in Baltimore, Maryland. You could see it and you could feel it. Now that doesn't mean that the criticism of Israel makes you an anti-Semite, but we have to be clear that what we're talking about is Zionism versus being a Jew, right? Because a Jew is not necessarily the same thing as a Zionist, right?
No, but also I think the definition of Zionism is being lifted up as something that not all of us consider, right? Like, I believe that Israel should have the right to exist. That doesn't mean that I believe everything Israel is doing as a state.
Correct.
I don't, right? Like,
Correct.
I don't, right? And I want us to be careful about the use of the word apartheid, and we're not going to get into a debate on this today, but that was a very specific thing that is not, okay, let's not get into it.
I was in Southern Africa in that battle. I was in Palestine in this battle. And in fact, that's why you got a statue of Nelson Mandela in front of, in Ramallah right now, that was given by the ANC to the Palestinians. So one of the things I want to just say in terms of this is that we need to have our minds open and we need to see it for what it is. I remember when we were in the battle and people kept trying to switch the subject around South Africa, and they would say, well, what about Idi Amin? And I said, what about Idi Amin? He's an oppressor too. And we can't support Uganda, this leadership of Uganda, but we have to stand up against it, right? And call it for what it is. And that doesn't mean that Israel doesn't have a right to exist. That doesn't mean
right.
Right.
Right. I appreciate that.
Right. But it does mean we want justice in the world and people to be treated with dignity and respect, and not for any particular group, anywhere in the world to have the powers over another group, because those people are of another group, right? So basically we want a system of equity, racial equality that exists not only in this country, but in this world.
And we call it out everywhere, not just where it's convenient.
That's right. So, I'm an internationalist, but I have to call it out. I mean, wherever it exists. We only got time for one more call, I believe, and then we need to go. Caller, good morning. We don't have another time. We don't have any more time. I just want to ask this quick question of you before we sign off. The DC has now one of the highest homicide rates in 18 years. What's going on and what can be done? I know that's a longer discussion. We only got probably 2 minutes to answer it. So go ahead.
Well, it's really disheartening and scary. And unfortunately, we had 4 shootings in a 24-hour period in Ward 1 this week. So my constituents and I are really feeling it. We're all living our lives here. We're trying to live our lives, raising our families, taking care of our loved ones. And we all deserve to live in communities free of violence. People have access to illegal weapons at alarming rates. There's more flooding the market. We've been trying to keep up with it, passing new laws to get ghost guns, getting them out of hands of people. We're going to keep at it. There's $215 million in this budget on violence prevention. It's going out the door. It's being implemented in our communities. This is about resolving conflicts, right? These shootings are about interpersonal conflicts and people picking up guns to resolve them. So we have to take on the guns and we have to mitigate the conflicts. And that is how we're going to end this. And it's happening all around the country. People are in a bad way because of COVID, in a bad way. We need some serious healing in this city, in this country. And that's how we get through this. There's no excuses for any of it, but I can just tell you that I and my colleagues are doing everything we can.
Amen. I want to thank you, Councilmember Brianne Nadeau, for taking the time to be with us this morning on What's at Stake, WPFW FM 89.3. I want to thank also you, the audience, for joining in the conversation this morning, and all the callers with very important and valuable things to ask and to talk about. I look forward to being with you again on the second Wednesday of the month. I would like to thank our engineer, Michael Nasala. I want to thank our executive producer, Verna Avery Brown. And I want to thank the entire WPFW community. I can't wait to be with you again. I want you to be empowered, be uplifted, and be blessed, knowing that we have a lot yet to get done, and we will get it done. Take care all.